Now, I don't think Senator Mondale requires extended introduction from me. He personifies the truth of the saying that in Minnesota, politics is a young man's game. At an age when most politicians are getting started, he has an established reputation as a United States Senator. Now, he's a native of Minnesota. He received some of his undergraduate education at an institution in our neighboring city, the corner of Augsburg College. He completed his undergraduate education and his legal education at the University of Minnesota. He served as Attorney General from 1960 to 1964, at which time he was elected to the United States Senate. Now, in the 4 years that he's served in the Senate, he has become identified with several important areas of legislation, particularly fair housing. I think many of us value the contribution that he made to the passage of that bill. He's also been, as many of you know, interested in consumer protection and poverty education. Now, he's going to talk to us today in general about some of the issues in the campaign. And following his presentation, there will be an opportunity to meet him and to ask questions and to drink coffee right across the hall. So we will retire there then at the close of his formal presentation. It's a great pleasure, then, Senator Mondale, to present you to this audience.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Carl, for that very kind introduction. I must say I never address an audience predominantly composed of Scandinavians without feeling sorry for myself. My great-grandfather, whose name we try to revere, came from Norway in 1858, a staunch Hauge Lutheran. He settled in a little town now known as Bryceland. He had served in the Civil War and because of that was entitled to certain property. His name at that time was Mondale. The patent from the federal government arrived and it was misspelled and it said Mondale. My great-grandfather valued his property more than he did his name. And he changed his name to Mondale. And the point I'm trying to make is that in this Scandinavian state, because of that, I lose 50,000 votes every election. Seriously, we face as difficult a time and some difficult decisions, indeed as difficult as we've ever faced in this coming election. And I think all of us as thoughtful Americans realize the serious nature of that which we face. What a strange and confused, disoriented, and in some ways embittered nation this is. One official report said, indeed, we're on the verge of becoming two nations, separate and unequal, one white, one black. For almost all of us in this room this morning, this is an unprecedented nation of wealth, of employment, and of opportunity. But for millions of other Americans, this is another nation, one of impoverishment, of under and unemployment, of poor housing, of undernourishment, and perhaps worst of all, a nation crippled by frustration, despair, and rage. We have produced a nation of unparalleled power, and yet we've proved our impotence in our cities and in Vietnam. We have produced a nation whose devotion to liberty and justice and to free criticism is both fundamental and historic. And yet we recently saw, as one analyst put it, a sudden convulsion of irrational rage, directed by some of us against others of us, a devastating tantrum of armed and uniformed adults against a youthful, helpless, and largely innocent rabble. Our nation, proud of its commitment to human rights, reads public opinion polls which show one of our top racists building such a following for the presidency that he could conceivably become a fundamental force in setting the future direction of our country. While we declare our commitment to peace, more than 27,000 American boys have died in Vietnam, and the cost of that war, now $30 billion annually, sharply diminishes our capacity to deal with our human problems here and abroad. While I believe we've tried for peace and sincerely want it, I do not believe that we have been as willing to take as great a risk to achieve a settlement as we once took to win the war through escalation. We are a nation proud of our institutions, our churches, our schools, government, business, labor, and other organizations. But for all they have done, our institutions have too often become, as one of our social critics put it, enormous potential sources of arbitrary and impersonal power, which folds, bends, spindles, and mutilates individuals, but keeps IBM cards immaculate. We are a nation proud of our compassion. The story of the Good Samaritan is almost an American folktale. But we have maintained and built a deeply entrenched welfare system that shatters pride and discourages effort. It provides so little help for so many that what should be a temporary need for assistance has become permanent despair and dependence. Whether the acknowledged objectives be decent education, or housing, or nutrition, health, or employment, there is a growing gap between what we want done, what we favor, the dreams we arouse and endorse, and what we are willing to do. The gulf between our goals and our willingness to spend to achieve them has created a political environment that enables a critic to claim that the rhetoric of public men abounds in big ideas with small price tags, or big ideas with no price tags at all. And ominously, some are now intensifying the old attempt to portray the human problems of this nation as the result of one single simple cause, namely, the lazy attitude of the mythical man who is able but unwilling to work. Since the problem is so simple, so is the proposed solution. The cry is now for more law and order, whatever that means. A change in attitude that is cheap and inexpensive because it requires only an act of will, a willingness by courts and police and others to get tough. Despite our commitment to human improvement, we defend Khe Sanh and abandon Job Corps camps. We head for the moon while men cannot afford to commute to work. We say we oppose violence, and yet we had great difficulty passing weak legislation to reduce the toll of some 18,000 lives a year lost by gunfire in this nation. And in the past 5 years, the victims have included President Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and a young man who entered the freshman class of the United States Senate with me, Robert Kennedy, a man who truly did dream of things that never were and wondered why not. Now, if I sound disappointed, I am. If I sound discouraged, I am not. And one of the reasons I'm not discouraged is that I think your generation offers the potential of relief from these contrasts. That your generation brings to this nation a new commitment to idealism, a new unwillingness to compromise with establishments that would compromise us all. That you bring to this nation a restiveness about these contrasts and a strong desire to do something about it, to cause this nation to rendezvous with its conscience, and to match our great power and our great wealth with a great commitment to our ideals. And nowhere and at no time is that put more to the test than in the coming campaign. I have heard many say that this is a good time to remain neutral. This is a good time to take a 4 or an 8-year vacation from citizenship. This is a good time to let the system cleanse itself, to let others take over and govern. For little can happen in the interim, and sooner or later we will reassume our responsibilities and begin to correct the wrongs that we all admit to exist in American society. Well, I wish to argue that that is a terrible mistake. I've been privileged to represent you in the Senate now for 2 full Congresses. I will admit that when I first went to the Senate, I came there with the view that we were wealthy enough to do anything we wanted to do, and do as many things as we decided we wanted to do. I no longer believe that's the case. I now believe that the real test of a citizen of this country who is truly devoted to justice and to human advancement is not in his theoretical commitment to good causes, but in the courage and wisdom with which he makes his choices, so that the resources of this country is in fact applied to the achievement of those causes, rather than for other purposes. And may I give you a few examples, the most obvious of which is the arms race and the pending escalation of that arms race. The figures that one talks about in terms of defense and the arms race boggles one's imagination. As I stand before you today, I think I have $18 in my pocket. That's my share of the $900 billion of gross national product. That's more than I had when I was a student at Macalester, but it's a lot less than we spend on defense. How does one... Those Republicans are always interrupting my remarks. How does one visualize and comprehend $30 billion? How do you have any way of knowing what that means? I don't know, but that's what we're spending every year in Vietnam. For 2 weeks, I spent almost full time trying to get $2 million to enforce the Fair Housing Act, and I was banished by many in the Senate as a left-wing radical. $2 million. Just before we adjourned this year in the Senate, we passed this year's annual defense budget, $72 billion. The largest defense budget in this nation's history. I don't know how much that is. I can't comprehend what it means. But it's about 8 times all the money we spend for human programs this year in the United States. What do we get out of this expenditure? Well, many things, and defense is an important part of this country's effort. But we have today a nuclear arsenal and a delivery system which within 3 or 4 hours, no matter what the Soviet Union does with everything they have, anti-ballistic missiles and the rest, could kill half of the population of the Soviet Union and destroy half of its industrial productivity. That's within just a few hours, and if they'll give us another day, we can take care of the rest of it. One of the problems with that strategy is that they would, at the same time, be doing the same thing to us. So thus far, the 2 greatest nations in terms of power and wealth in this world have managed through the expenditure of billions and billions of dollars to strike a level of military power where it permits each of us to virtually destroy the earth if we decide to do so. One wonders whether that ought not to be enough. But for many, it is simply a beginning. One of the key debates in this Congress was whether we ought to begin the deployment. That means the manufacture of the hardware, the placement in place of an anti-ballistic missile. They call it a thin system. It's sort of like cancer or pregnancy, always with the Defense Department. A thin system costing only 5 to 15 billions of dollars, a fairly modest sum for that department. But there's no one that I know that studied this problem who doesn't believe that the Defense Department would like to spend at least another $100 billion in the next decade to strengthen our capacity to destroy whoever our enemies might be. On the theory that our only real defense is not negotiations, is not understanding among the countries, is not an effort to reach an equality, but rather to continue to reach for a superiority which always puts the enemy in an inferior position, assuming that they will accept any such inferior status. Now, the truth of it is, and the history since World War II proves it beyond any doubt, that every time we escalate the arms race, they escalate the arms race. And we're not more secure, we're less secure. And each escalation is followed by the next. And so I think one of the real tests of our time is the election of leadership determined to reach across those boundaries of differences that separate nation states and to try to end the proliferation of the nuclear bomb, to try to reach an agreement that prevents further escalations in the development of arms across this world. Because if we don't do so, if we fail in this effort, the 50 to 100 billions of dollars that we will spend on additional armaments in the next decade will literally rob this nation of any real prospect of dealing with our problems here at home or even contributing substantially to the problems of hunger and deprival around this tragic globe. The second issue, it seems to me, that will not permit time is the question of the alienation of the races in this society. This is one of the liberal institutions in this state. It's one of the finest colleges in this state. I don't see a single Negro in this chapel this morning. Isn't this one example of why the Kerner Commission the other day concluded that we are no longer one nation, but on the verge of becoming two nations? white and black, separate and unequal. The other day, a professor at New York University said that both Humphrey and Nixon were bastard racists. Wherever I go in this country, and I've been in many of the ghettos and talked to many of its leaders, I can tell you that I hear a growing, profound, hateful alienation of the black from the white in this country. There is an unraveling, a tearing apart, a loss of mutual confidence, a real feeling that white America is basically indecent, that we're basically intolerant to their needs for jobs and housing and good health and good education and for hope and opportunity. Something that we read about but which they feel every day in their lives. The whip of discrimination. Now, we're the only nation, virtually, trying to live the dream of a society in which color is irrelevant. The Rhodesian and Union of South Africa's example might not be as remote as many of us think. Even in England, the efforts to reconcile the races and make that issue irrelevant has virtually failed. We are the last nation, one of the last, to harbor the dream of a society in which color is irrelevant, a society in which every American has a full and fair opportunity for what we've come to take for granted in American life. If we spend 4 or 8 years ignoring this problem, if we let it continue to unravel, if we select leadership that has no confidence in the black community, I'm not so sure that the depth of frustration and rage and hatred will not have reached the point where the possibilities of retrieving our dream and achieving it will be destroyed forever. Finally, may I say this. I'm privileged to serve on the Housing and Urban Development Committee of the United States Senate, dealing with the nation's physical, housing, mass transit problems, and the rest. And I'm also privileged to serve on the Labor and Education Committee, which deals with the education, health, and nutritional requirements of our people. And I must say that those who speak of neutrality, in my mind, indicate a certain arrogance toward the needs of the deprived in American society. What right do we, as prosperous middle-class and upper-class white Americans, Protestants to boot, to say to the millions of Americans in substandard, unsafe housing, in ghetto environments that destroy any hope or opportunity, to the millions who can't find a job, and if they do, find a menial job with no hope or opportunity, to the 10 million Americans suffering malnutrition and, yes, starving today, to the millions of Americans who go to school at institutions hardly worthy of the word, to children who by the 6th grade are already 3 grades behind, to the Indian in Minnesota, 90% of whom drop out of high school, to the some 20 million Negroes who without any doubt have far less chance to live as long as we do, live as well as we do, earn as much as we do, or participate in most of the benefits of American society as much as we do. What right do we have? What right do any of us have to say we've decided you can wait 4 or 8 years longer for a decent life in American society, and perhaps the next generation will get a chance when we interest ourselves once again? No, it seems to me that the responsibilities of citizenship are those which are imposed upon us at all times in every way. That if we're serious about justice and decency in American society, it is not a sometime thing. It is something that involves a total commitment throughout our entire lives. And I would remind us of what John Gardner recently said. He said, I believe that we are being most true to ourselves as Americans. We are seeking a society in which every young person has the opportunity to grow to full stature. A society in which every older person can live out his years in dignity. A society in which no one is irreparably damaged by circumstances that can be prevented. The release of human potential, the enhancement of individual dignity, the liberation of the human spirit. These are the deepest and the truest goals to be conceived by the hearts and the minds of the American people. And these are the ideas that can sustain and strengthen a great civilization. May it be said of us, as it was of a friend of ours just a few months ago, let us be remembered as simply good and decent men who saw wrong and tried to right it, saw suffering and tried to heal it, saw war and tried to stop it.